Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This seat's really swinging in. So, typically what I like to start is so that people sort of get to know you a little bit. So, like, where are you from originally, and like, what did your parents do?
Sure. I was born and raised in Sacramento. I went to high school at Rio Americano. Then I did a little stint at AR while I was still in high school, and then I wound up transferring to UC Davis. My mother was from San Francisco, and she was a high school teacher at Rio Americano for about 30 years. And my father was a business consultant for large multinational conglomerates.
All right, real local boy that did well. So, what was your first job? You think of?
First job was probably my lawnmower business. I was going around and mowing everybody's lawns to save up for all the Nintendo cartridges and all the Sega Genesis cartridges and all that good stuff. So I was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 at that time. I was always building businesses. From there, not too long after, I'd say probably 12 or 13, I started getting in the hardware side of things. This was Dell and Gateway, where the Micron computers were the only computers that you could order online that were heavy hitters. So I wound up convincing my parents to give me some money, and I started building servers and selling them out to business heads and other things. And that paid for a lot of good toys.
All right. Yeah, my kids are here, so I'm trying to get them to be exposed to entrepreneurship. So I'm thinking my son could actually maybe start mowing lawns now.
Not your daughter.
Her too, actually. So, I'm going through your LinkedIn profile, and actually it was kind of you actually started your first job out of Davis was in real estate. So
Yeah.
how did you go from real estate to founding DialSource?
There was a lot of money being made in real estate. And so I figured that being an economist by education, that it was a time period. And I wanted to get involved and see what I could learn as a result. And so I was in it for a short stint, probably about 6 months, which resulted in moving the idea from our first prototypes into an actual program. And so I moved from there in a short period into deciding to make the leap and start my own business.
So you had the idea for DialSource before you went into real estate.
Yes. So it actually came about from some of the internships that I was doing while an undergrad at UC Davis, and I had to make a lot of phone calls for research purposes and for various types of purposes. And I couldn't get people on the phone, and when I did, it was hard to collect information, and so I needed a way in which to be more effective in collecting information and storing it. And so having some beers on my patio with some buddies, we decided to convince UC to let us do our own course, which was Telecommunication Outsourced Labor, which turned into a research paper, which was then published in the American Computer Machinery Journal.
So you actually convinced the school to have your, I guess, independent study, or?
It was 2 quarters at Davis in a joint program between Davis and Berkeley. So I had a CS professor and an economics professor that would help us sculpt the idea, which turned into a research project, and that was how it started. But that was a paper. We never decided to build a business from it. It wasn't the intention.
So how did, so actually before we go on, can you explain what DialSource is? I think, can give people an overview. What
Sure.
DialSource is.
So where we started and where we are is very different. DialSource is the global leader in communications, automation, and analytics for Salesforce.com and more recently Microsoft. So in essence, what this means is we help organizations make more intelligent decisions on who they're engaging with in sales processes. Who do we talk to? What are we talking to them about? How long did we talk to them? And from those conversations, there's always data that's derived. They buy something, they don't buy something, or the flip side of that into service applications. Are you a client? Do you have an existing revenue opportunity? Do you maybe have a technical case associated? And we use intelligence to provide better decision making on how the technology should facilitate conversations, improving client experience, saving time and efficiency in the organization, and providing the management the ability to make faster and more accurate decisions.
So when you first started DialSource, what was the original concept? Like what was your MVP?
Yeah, the MVP was minimally viable product, was for going against like what was referred to as a predictive dialer. And so these were these technologies that would place a huge amount of phone calls out so people could have conversations. And as 3 guys out of college, we didn't have a lot of time. We had a lot of phone calls to make. That was the initial goal, was to design a new technology that would be faster and more efficient. And that was a continuous iteration process. that just allowed us to refine based on what clients were telling us and what problems were existing, and perhaps a bit of our hubris thinking that we could just solve all these problems and go ahead into it.
So, one of the things when I talk to startups, they have a really big challenge is developing, someone will have an idea and getting the resources to build that idea. So how did you get, your resource, the resources to build your MVP?
I never concerned myself with what I didn't have. I always maximized what I did have. And I think that's a real important mentality for somebody that's running a startup organization because you're going to be starved at all points. It doesn't matter how successful you are. If you're aggressive, you're going to be constantly striving and constantly grasping for something out of your reach. So my only resources were a couple of buddies. If I could convince them that there was something greater as a purpose and something that we would gain as a result, then we should tackle this idea. And I was crazy enough to persuade them to join.
So was it a hard sale, or was it?
No, I got them well and drunk on the patio when I started pitching. Oh, we were, kids in college. What else do we do?
So this kind of leads to because in some ways, I had an opportunity to visit your facilities yesterday, and I understand what you do because I used to be a sales engineer, so I saw a lot of these sales processes. So for a lot of people that aren't in sales, I don't think they get what you do.
Sure.
So with that said, how did you get it's sort of a high, very cerebral sales process.
It is, yeah, it's
So how
complicated.
did you get your first customer?
Well, back then the technology was not as complicated and as powerful as it is today, so the message was simpler. But the message that I wanted to convey was that we were going to help your organization be more efficient and make better decisions as a result. And that's a pitch everybody can understand, and that's a pitch that everybody can appreciate as one of constantly improving within their organization. And so then I would listen to clients where they said, well, it's really good at this, but if it did that, it'd be amazing. And I have this other problem, and this other technology can't address it. And so we just kept working around the clock to wind up solving these problems and iterate.
So how long did it take you to get your first customer? And who was it? Can you say who your first customer was?
I don't remember my first customer. I think I remember my second customer. Not very long. We went from design, and initial design was me sitting down with a big legal tab of paper, designing what a phone call tree looked like and what a sales process looked like. And then I put them on top of each other. And then I started connecting dots from there. Once we had that MVP, and we actually had a UI on it, a user interface, some basic components to it, and this predated Facebook and many other things. At the time, MySpace was the big deal. So I was finding people on MySpace, or I'd heard about a successful business, and I was sending out messages to the CEOs of these businesses saying, this is who I am, this is our technology, and I want to pitch it. We wound up signing a local real estate company. I don't remember the name of them at the time. And they wound up saying yes, and I went into their office. I remember getting an argument with my then business partner, and he said we'd never make $50 on this idea. So I said $50 a month a seat. I walked back with like a $20,000, $25,000 check.
Wow.
And I was like, I think we need to open a bank account. And we probably need a business license, and we probably should hire a lawyer because I don't know what I'm doing.
So you actually sold this before you even formed the company?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we had generated something like $100,000 in revenue before we actually had a business license. And we did it in a short period of time.
Wow. So I think when I was talking to you just earlier, you kind of had this early success. So what were some of your challenges in scaling the product?
There was a lot of them. So what did I understand as scale as a 20-something coming out of Davis when the cloud really hadn't even taken off yet? It was a huge, huge challenge we understood nothing about. And we needed to iterate again in this almost real-time state. We went from the early versions of on-prem servers out of my house to then on-prem servers at the client's location. And then we started getting some early data centers, I'd say maybe 06, 07. Once we started signing some accounts in the Salesforce ecosystem, very quickly it became apparent 07, 08 that this wasn't going to work. So we went and got a data center. I won't name them, they're a big data center. They were unable to scale with us at the time. And it was a huge problem. And with the nature of our technology stack, telephony, everything must be real time. There is no requery the server, requery a packet. So if the server's not performing properly or the environment's not performing properly, the customer experience is terrible. And so as we started growing, and that was causing the business to collapse, And on top of it, the financial industry was collapsing. It was a huge, difficult problem for us in 2008 and 9 to first get our first data center, outgrow it, and then in the middle of the night, on Christmas Eve, transition data centers because nobody was going to be using DialSource the next day.
So, actually, so before I met you, I kind of was looking through your LinkedIn profile, and I kind of expected you to be more salesy, partly because of the product, and partly I was just looking at your LinkedIn, you had your stint in real estate. And when I talked to you, you're actually very much more like a CTO in my mind. You're very technical. And with an economics degree, how did you get this technical acumen?
I was always into technology at a young age. I mean, I was fortunate enough when my parents kind of pushed me in that direction. I was able to if I got the good grades in school, I got all the video games and all the other things that they made me earn. And then I very quickly transitioned into like computers in junior high. All the best computer games were on terminals and hardware. And then I had to build that hardware in order to piece the components together. My buddies and I were ordering stuff all over the place or getting it locally. And that really kind of like set me down that path, I think. And I just kind of pursued it. I always liked gadgets, I always liked technology, and I decided that was something that I wanted to do.
So how come you didn't go to computer, comp sci seems to be more of a natural fit for you as opposed to economics?
Yeah. At the time that I was finishing high school and going to college, I really wanted to go into foreign exchange trading. I wanted to go do something along those lines. And so that was something I knew nothing about. And so I thought at the time I was going to get the economics degree and probably go for an MBA and maybe even a PhD in economics. And I was going to go move out to Wall Street and work there. But then I quickly realized that was more old school and I wanted to be more new school and I want to be on this coast in technology.
One of the things like actually, so I talked to you yesterday. You basically felt that DialSource really started 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about some of the challenges you had to encounter, to have your fresh start?
Yeah, so I think as a whole, we took a very different approach to this. Most organizations, I think, come up with an idea, then they go raise some seed funding or angel funding, make up some prototypes, generate some revenue, then they go the A. We did it very, very different. And part of it was by design and some of it was by circumstances. The individuals that I founded the organization with more than a decade ago had a fundamental and philosophical difference from me. I wanted to build a big empire. They did not. That's a big difference. So we just didn't see eye to eye. And as a result, unfortunately, we got involved in a very complicated, nearly 4-year buyout on the equity and the IP. And you can't raise any money if you're fighting over who owns what because it's too much risk for the investor. And I just had to swallow that pill. And so we had to make some very difficult decisions and say, if we want to survive this, we have to make decisions along the following. We need to survive, and we need to make sure we're making general counsel paid so that we're upholding everything in our dispute over these matters. We need to generate only enough revenue to make payroll and pay general counsel. And we couldn't afford to win the big deals that were showing up on our step because it increased the value of the organization while I was in an active buyout through partners. And so it was artificially constraining the organization. That was very, very difficult. That didn't have a necessary light at the end of the tunnel. And 3 years in, I thought it would never end.
So you finally got it resolved, and then you had to go raise money. So
Yeah.
what was, did they see that whole process as negative or that you had gone through?
No, quite the contrary, I think. It's a very strong positive. And I say this because it has been brought up in the 2 rounds of funds that have been raised, because we couldn't raise till that was behind us, right? And so it showed that there was low operational and execution risk for DialSource, and also for our perspective, we had low technological risk because we already had a big product. And so investors had brought this up over and over again in the due diligence and even after funding, that they were confident in our ability to first understand what the actual problem is and then identify a solution and pivot point for execution. So being able to go through a partnership dispute while buying out the company, while developing product, and while tracking over 7 figures a year is a very difficult combination of variables to make succinct over a multi-year period. And so if we can survive that, then I think we can survive a lot of the other problems that are more common in businesses that have a lower temperature.
So you successfully raised, I think, over $7 million.
Yeah, close enough.
So what was how hard was it to raise funds? And that's usually talking to, and I could talk to a few of the entrepreneurs here. That's the biggest challenge is raising funds.
I would say the biggest challenge is building a product.
So build the product first.
Have a good product and have a good client base and have them rave about you and your technology, the company, and then it's third party that's saying this is what's going on. It helped even though like Stanford, who's a client of ours, is not a big account, we don't generate a lot of revenue with them. We like it when Stanford has to say good things about how smart the engineers are at DialSource and how good they're treated and how we're constantly innovating with them. Then they hook us up with USC, and it just kind of goes down. So when you kind of have this growth, it helps that out. It is by no means easy to raise funds, but you really, I think, need to focus on what is your SWOT model. What are your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and how are you pivoting as a result to make sure that at each of these inflection points that you're reasonably aware of what the next level of challenges are and that you're going to have a plan to deal with them.
So actually, so what were your like some of your competitors? I think you had mentioned some of your competitors were very successful, and like how did you
Yeah, the number 2 through number 5 spots in communications for Salesforce have all raised between, I'd say, 100 and 300 million dollars. They all have valuations between 800 and 1.9 billion. And those were organizations that raised a lot of money and built big sales teams on what I would consider archaic technology, sunsetting technology. And so that was a problem for us when we were in these buyouts and we couldn't grow and we're losing accounts with better technology. But that was also another challenging environment to be by far the least equipped to fight the fight.
Okay. And then one of the things I'm impressed is it is a complex sales process.
Yeah.
So, and then you're also dealing with like enterprise sales, and that's its own skill set.
Yep.
Can you talk about how you got your sales team equipped to selling into the enterprise?
Sure. It's been a challenging process, and we're constantly iterating within departments. And so to the sales department, we have several guys out here from DialSource in our sales department, and a lot of these guys are at different stages within their career. Some individuals have come right from UC Davis, from the vendor floor, where we've had fortune to meet good people and self-groom them, and we've hired others externally. It's a difficult process to build a sales team, especially to the enterprises, as you mentioned, and so we wind up staging them out. So if you're starting in with DialSource, you'll be working in smaller accounts, kind of cut your teeth, learn the ropes there. It's less complicated, less decision makers, less political interests behind the scenes, and then work up from there. But there is no specific playbook, I think, in the sales application stack for what we're doing, because I don't believe anybody's necessarily been here before. So we're constantly learning from our mistakes.
So how do you I think you had mentioned some of your big clients. How do you not get on the, knock on the door and get in front of them?
The big ones you don't. They have to come to you. Like, a lot of the big ones were just unfortunately not allowed to name, but they're household names, publicly traded organizations. Those were accounts that knew about us within the space. We've been sponsoring Salesforce's big global conference, Dreamforce, for many, many years. So constantly having a presence there, constantly partnering with other thought leaders, constantly showing off new product builds credibility. And then when you have other major milestones that happen, and there was an interesting one that happened just recently to your point. I always struggled up until about a year ago to explain to a large enterprise why they don't need to worry about us as a small organization. We have the right technology, we have the right team, and we have the right mentality to execute in their betterment. After we raised the funds and we started getting a lot of publications, those questions weren't asked anymore. And so kind of like all of a sudden changes after you've been doing it a certain way for a certain period of time.
Okay. And the other thing I was actually impressed with is you kind of gave me a tour of your space, and you had customer service managers, CSMs.
Yeah.
And I think all of them have a computer science, bachelor's in computer science. And that's actually one of the challenges I see with tech companies in general, is just getting good tech people here. And you have a whole account management team that all essentially have computer science degrees. How did you end up doing that? How did you do that?
Lots of iterations. And it really comes back to part of what you were talking about, like the difficulty of selling large organizations and enterprise. There became an inflection point where organizations were saying, you guys invented this technology, so we don't want to pay third party to do it. You do it. And as we started migrating from SMB into enterprise, it became more complicated. And so we realized that understanding a lot of the programming languages and that thought mentality in solving problems as an engineer would help the teams succeed. But it wasn't always that way, and we lost a lot of deals and got a lot of black eyes when we were too quick with options without the right ones. But it has been a big success for us having deep technical resources in these larger, more complicated enterprise sales.
So how are you able to recruit these guys, though? I guess that's
Well, I originally went back to Davis maybe 3 years ago and said, after we'd done some funding, that I was having a hard time finding great minds and that we wanted to recruit. And they loved the story. Right? I wrote the paper there. We'd worked all these years with a bunch of UC kids to build this company. We were scrappy, we were innovative, and so we lined up with the Internship and Career Center. We started sponsoring the job fairs. They started asking me to do guest lectures at the GSM school, at the engineering school. We started bringing in students. Word got around. The students that were doing paid internships were getting jobs and careers at DialSource. That was spreading around. Then professors were making introductions. And so there was a lot of time and nurturing that went into that program, but we still do it. We still go to just about every single job fair. We have a big DialSource booth, and we're recruiting well-paid internships on the path to well-paid career.
So really, a big source of recruiting is just coming from the direct people just graduated from school and you're sort of grooming them.
Yep. In various departments.
So what are your what's your general plan for growth at this point?
Fast.
What's your vision?
Well, it breaks down into stages, I suppose, right? I mean, one of the things that an individual and an entrepreneur needs to understand is once you start taking funding, it's no longer about what you want to do all the time, but you have specific obligations to your investors, and you need to grow the organization, and you need to continue to press innovation. And so there's multiple metrics to it. I want to grow our sales by 150% over last year, which is a pretty big percentage at our stage of an organization. I want to be able to finish going to market on the new version of DialSource Denali that we spent 3 years engineering and went into market last year. And that is taking us more from the product we have been in this communication into more of a full-fledged communication application in the cloud for large organizations. And we're deploying that at international scale now. So we've got accounts from we've got accounts in Israel, we've got accounts in Canada, all over the United States, but we're jumping more internationally and leaving behind some of the compliance concerns with scaling out with different countries, organizations, and legal compliance by some of the changes in the technology.
Okay. Actually, at this point, I'm going to open up the questions to the audience. So if you guys have any questions? Laura?
I have a question about your original co-founders, and then later on you guys had a dispute, which is not unusual.
Sure.
But is there anything that you learned from that you might give advice to people here who are looking for
Absolutely.
co-founders?
It's a great question. My advice to that would be if you are wholly committed to starting your business and you're putting everything in, go hire good attorneys first. Put an articles of incorporation together. Put a partnership agreement together. Have all your docs put together, because the big problem that I had was when we didn't know anything, we went to the state and filed for a business license under the terms and conditions that the state puts as a general template. But we had some really wacky conditions that I won't get involved in here. But those were not encountered or defined in those boilerplate documents. And so if I had gone and spent $10,000 in the beginning, it would have saved me probably $1.5 million cash down the road.
Wow. Any questions?
What motivates you?
To change the way in which the world communicates, specifically into the enterprise. I say kind of asterisk enterprise because we've broadened to American Diabetes Association runs their donations and centers on DialSource. And that's not something that I originally anticipated, but when it came to us, I'm like, wow, that's neat. My parents are diabetic and they've donated. So that's a really interesting way to help. And so there's been all kinds of other ways that we can help that now I think kind of broaden into communications.
Who are your primary competitors?
Our most direct competitor is InsideSales.com. They are a similar application stack that I would qualify more as a sales and marketing organization, as opposed to us as a software engineering firm at our core. Indirectly, we compete more with things in the sales acceleration space, along the lines of Sales Loft and things of that nature.
Is your product integrated both inbound and outbound?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So we do really sophisticated things on inbound, like when we can do with the Kings as an example. So if you're a client of the Kings, you're a contact, and you've purchased tickets before, and you're calling into the Kings, DialSource can identify who you are, what revenue opportunities are associated with you. Did you go to the last game? Maybe you had tickets so you didn't go to the last 3 games. And they need that information when they're calling in to see if there's a problem there. And this is where this analytics helps make real-time decisions on routing and decision process after the fact.
Yeah, first of all, it's really inspiring to hear you coming from Davis. I just
Thanks.
graduated from law school there. Joel just graduated, or he's
You
graduating.
guys hear that?
this weekend.
There's a lawyer in the audience.
Not yet, I'm
no.
studying the bar right now. But, so my question to you is, I mean, because we're, starting this thing and this company, and we both have sort of ordinary jobs lined up, like I'm going to be working at a law firm, and Joel's working right now. And so sort of, how did you decide to make that leap from working in real estate for those 6 months and then just deciding to throw it into your company?
That's a good question.
I was working on the paper and the prototypes before going into real estate. Real estate was the proving grounds for the technology. And so I started doing really well really quickly because I was as efficient as a 20-person sales center by myself. And so I generated a decent amount of funds from that to then go hire other people and then build servers and other things. So we were in the position where we were literally generating revenue while we were incurring cost. But I would say that there was no question to the commitment that this was everything and it was all day and all night to do this. And I think a mistake that a lot of individuals make that want to make a startup is that they have a day job because they think they need that in order to pay for the startup. But I don't think you can really build a successful big business if you're not wholly committed to the success and the challenges you absolutely will face along the way. So I would say go all in as fast as possible, which puts the pressure on you to figure out how to monetize to pay your bills. Without that pressure, you might not be your best self.
Any other questions?
So are you guys headquartered out of Sacramento?
We are, yeah. Our office is right next door to the 24-Hour Fitness on J. So that black glass building, the top floor is split between the Kings. Actually, it's Kings building. And the top floor is split between them and us. They're great partners of ours. In fact, when Vivek came in, it made a lot of sense for technology. We came into that transition. And so over the course of Golden Center 1 and the selling and the servicing of that, we had a huge portion of that in all of the sales and service and then in building the technology. And as a result, we really galvanized a deep partnership with the Kings that we're particularly proud of. And when we were expanding and before we raised the money, they gave us unique opportunities saying, we want to have early access to your technology. Why don't you come consider moving in with us? And so that sounds pretty good.
They invited you to move in there?
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Sorry. Fan, Sacramento.
So a follow-up question, I guess. So how is it being a startup in Sacramento? Are there pros and cons?
There's pros and cons everywhere, right? But this was a question for me I didn't know the answer to in 2009, 10, 11. I really thought that I needed to bring my business in. I grew up half in San Francisco. My mom's side was there, and I was spending all my weekends missing all the good cartoons, commuting back and forth, and I hated it. And so I really wrestled with, I need to be out there. That's where the brain power is. That's where the other things are that I need to build my business. I was fortunate enough to never be able to afford it and decided to stay here until I could afford it. And then I decided, why do I want to move there when we have access to great universities, Sac State, Davis, Berkeley, and I can take the funds that I would be spending for real estate there and hire brilliant minds to come help me build. And so we decided, instead of having a fancy office and a fancy location, which we do have now, that we wanted to have fancy brains and fancy product. So we stayed here.
So I admire your cool, calm, collected, analytical nature.
Thank you.
Because, it symbolizes a consistent theme that I see among successful people. It builds resilience.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
I admire that. But my question is, you claim that
No,
next level?
people think it's an overnight success because I read an article like we raised, $5 million in a Series A. They don't see the 12 years that came before it. And it's really that 12 years and the persistence associated to it. And so while we had to be in the right place to have the big enterprise accounts come to us, it wasn't always that way. We had to pick the wins that we could win at. And so that had to be start somewhere, which was start in the Sacramento area, then the larger NorCal area. And it started out with 5 user accounts and then 10 user accounts. And then they would rave. And if you do really well, they go tell their buddies, right? Hey, look, we got this technology. It's really helping us make better decisions. We made our ROI in the first 90 days. You should look at it. That helped with credibility. And so that kind of like rolled and scaled as the rest of the organization did. And so I think it is the persistence and the ability to execute consistently that helps build that trajectory.
What were some of the pivots? Did you have any pivots along the way? Or
Lots.
what were some of the notable pivots then?
Having my business partner take off in the middle of the night to go to Thailand without telling me and not showing up to any of his meetings as my CTO was a big pivot point. And so that's where the buyout started. Another big pivot point was signing the buyouts. After 3 years, or go over 3 years, signing the buyouts was a big pivot point. Another one from that was because we'd worked so hard and people knew our technology, I had some heavy hitters come out of Silicon Valley that said, we know what your technology is, we've seen it from the sidelines, we want in, we want to invest. So raising the first round of friends and family and raising a pretty sizable friends and family at almost $1.8 million in the friends and family round was a big pivot point. Closing the largest Series A in our space was a big pivot point. We are now just executing our first 1,000 user deal, which is a pivot point.
Any questions? Go ahead.
You talk about listening to your customers. As you guys build out your new product suite or your extended product suite, how do you make sure the voice of the customer gets infused in the product design and development?
Well, it's a combination of things, right? I mean, Jobs said it often that people don't necessarily know what they want, right? I mean, people were on flip phones until he showed them an iPhone, and then everybody wanted that. So I think it's really a balancing act of being able to solve your clients' problems, innovate at the same time. And I was terrible at this at the beginning. We were so far ahead of the engineering curve that we were solving a problem people did not understand was a problem. And then having to go back and explain the solution, I'm like, but I just want this. I'm like, yeah, but it does this, plus 50 more things, and it costs less than the next best thing. You'd think it'd be a simple thing, but it wasn't. And so we've really kind of, as we've grown as an organization by putting the right people at the head of each of the departments, and then having cohesive communication, we're having the head of customer success and the head of implementation and the department head meetings talking about what are the clients talking about. And then they meet with the head of sales and talk about what's the market viability to it. So like at the end of the year when we had some numbers that we wanted to hit, we had to make sure that, is this a complicated feature with low amount of dollars to it, or is it the opposite? And so we aligned literally on the 30th and 31st to execute some big contracts because we were able to do some simple things for some big accounts that helped us generate a lot of revenue as a result. And so there's a constant pivot and understanding of these shifting variables that I think a founder needs to grab on the pulse of.
So, what are you at as far as like Series A, Series B? Where are you on?
We closed our Series A Q3 last year.
Okay, so you're still pretty early. But you said you want to grow.
Yep.
Are you growing toward an exit?
There's always an exit.
There's always an exit.
You're either
Is
being
that-
acquired or you're going public, right? Both exits.
And do you think that might be in the near future, or just can't really talk about it right now?
I could talk about it at a high overview. We're tracking very aggressively towards our Series B. We have a very large valuation that we're chasing and raise. We have VCs in our office on a weekly basis from around the country. Previous to the Series A, I was the one traveling everywhere. I was the one going to Silicon Valley and San Francisco and working hard for those meetings. And it's now lots of inbound phone calls, lots of inbound emails, lots of meetings, lots of travel here. I'd say that we're either going to be acquired by one of the largest organizations in the world, in the enterprise space, or we're going to go the IPO route. I've spent years thinking about both. There's pros and cons to both. I think the IPO route is, do I see myself being a CEO into my 60s, leading a large organization, or do I want to go through an acquisition and cash out and find the next series of entrepreneurs and fund them myself because I've been here? They're both difficult questions, and I don't know the answer to it yet.
So one of the things that Sacramento doesn't have that, for example, Austin has because of Dell and all the millionaires Dell made, are people in the community investing back into the community, into startups. Do
Sure.
you see yourself doing that someday, putting money
Yes.
back into Sacramento?
Yes. We have office and footprint in Austin. Our telephony department is out there. I originally thought I'd have to raise a Series A from Sand Hill or go to Boston because of what I wanted to do. However, we were able to raise all the funds in Sacramento. All of our funds came from Sacramento, and everything that we spent money on went back into Sacramento. So Moss Adams does our accounting, and Stoll wound up doing the paperwork and the legal side on the Series A. So not only we take the money to hire more talent, but we're also funding more jobs here. I also thought that if I was going to track towards a $15 million raise in our Series B, that I would have to go to the Valley to raise that kind of funds. I don't believe that anymore. I believe that I could probably put this round together in Sacramento again. So there is money here. There are people that are looking for these larger investments, and we were fortunate enough to have several of them come to us and partner with us, and there's lots of discussions about what Sacramento tech looks like in the next 10 years, and I would like to and expect to play a good part in it.
Thank you.
What do you think Sacramento tech looks like the next 10 years?
I think it's going to have a very transformative effect. I know some of the big projects I'm not at liberty to speak about, and I'm quite excited about that. I think that there's a lot of interest in expanding, obviously, the Valley, which is not sustainable by headcount, dollar, et cetera. And I think the Sacramento is a natural progression by talent, by location, and by some individuals that have really heavy-hitting influence into Sacramento who are well motivated to it. And so I've committed here to my investors, and I've committed to others that Sacramento will be the DialSource headquarters, and we will expand into other cities, but this will be our headquarters.
So after you raise your Series A, you had mentioned that VCs are coming to you now. Is that because you raised your Series A, or is there some other?
It's that, but it's also the type of round that we raised and the criteria around the round and the size of the accounts that we're signing and the speed in which we're signing them. So it's not typical for an organization of our size to be signing these type of large enterprise accounts. And so the speed of which we're doing it and adds to the multiplier, which then adds to the immediacy of we're going to get funded eventually, and somebody's going to do that funding. So the conversations are, we know who you are, we want to have these conversations, we want to keep talking to you at the end of each quarter to see how the numbers look, and you tell us when you're getting ready to pull the trigger.
Okay. It's cool that they're coming to you. That's really
It's very cool. I didn't expect it by the end of closing the A. I hopefully don't jinx it now. But it's really the thing we were talking about earlier about, I think, the hard work and the diligence and the success and the failures. Cannot overlook the failures. Nobody made it to the top by themselves, and nobody made it there without failing an awful lot. So I think harnessing those things is kind of what makes people understand the resilience of DialSource. I read an interesting article, Stanford talked about this. They said basically, the Valley's had it wrong. Don't be the unicorn, be the cockroach. Can't kill a cockroach. Cockroach lives on forever. It's resilient through anything. That's the type of teams that I think the organizations and the VCs are looking for, an organization that can survive a nuclear winter.
That's actually a good title for the blog, Be the Cockroach.
Be the cockroach.
Any more questions? All right, so final question for you, and I think after meeting you, it might be hard for you. Who's your favorite superhero?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I grew up a big comic book nerd. I always liked the X-Men. I liked Colossus. He was always a favorite of mine, and I had a big comic book collection growing up and collected a lot of the early comic book X-Men comic books.
X-Men 141. Well, you are a superhero for us, and we actually made.
Oh, thank you very much.
So it's an Android game, and you could show it to all your sales reps here.
Awesome.
They could
Samurai
watching
Tillman, I
drive.
love it. You're very good.
So thanks so much for coming and
My
supporting our
pleasure.
community.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.